The students of BA Part 3 English Literature, Paper 2, have the short story A Cup of Tea, which is written by Katherine Mansfield, prescribed for them. You read Katherine Mansfield as a story writer in BA Part 1 when you were prescribed the short story The Doll's House, written by her. Before we take a look at the story itself, let us quickly go through a brief biography of Katherine Mansfield. She was born in 1888 and she died in 1923. Katherine Mansfield was born Kathleen Mansfield Beauchamp in Wellington, New Zealand on October 14, 1888. Innovative, accessible, and psychologically acute, Mansfield's numerous short stories pioneered the genre's shape in the 20th century. Genre means the style that is adopted, whether it is in literature or whether it is in any form of art. Her fiction, poetry, journals, and letters cover an array of subjects: the difficulties and ambivalences of the families and sexuality, the fragility and vulnerability of relationships, the complexities and insensitivities of the rising middle classes, the social consequences of war, and overwhelmingly, the attempt to extract whatever beauty and vitality one can from mundane and increasingly difficult experiences. कहने का मतलब ये है that कैथरीन मैन्सफील्ड बहुत सेंसिटिवली आम लोगों के जो भाव होते हैं उनको अपनी कहानी के माध्यम से एक्सप्रेस करती हैं. एजुकेटेड इन वेलिंगटन एंड लंदन, वेलिंगटन न्यूजीलैंड जो कि सदर्न हेमिस्फीयर के का एक देश है, वहाँ न्यूजीलैंड उसमें एक शहर है. Mansfield left New Zealand for England at the age of 19 to begin a career as an author. यंग एज में ही वो उन्होंने घर छोड़ दिया था क्योंकि वो लेखन कार्य करना चाहती थी. Much of Mansfield's early work is in the form of the sketch, in which a segment means a section of life, is described in highly popular in journals of the time. Her first collection, In a German Pension, written in 1911, consists primarily of sketches satirically presenting Germans from the point of view of a quiet, observant young English woman. In the following years, she frequently published stories in Rhythm and the Blue Review, both edited by John Middleton Murray, whom she married in 1918 after divorcing George Borden. The couple, that is Katherine Mansfield and Middleton Murray, became well known in London's literary circles and were connected with D.H. Lawrence and Frida Weekly Lawrence. In France during the summer of 1915, Mansfield spent time with her brother Leslie, reflecting on their family and life in New Zealand. Tragically, Leslie was killed during training for service in World War I, blown to bits while demonstrating how to throw a hand grenade, remarked Mansfield. ये विडम्बना है कि वो ट्रेनिंग ले रहे थे और उसी ट्रेनिंग के दौरान एक बम की चपेट में आकर वो हथगोला जिसको कहते हैं हैंड ग्रेनेड, उसकी चपेट में आके मैन्सफील्ड के जो ब्रदर थे लेस्ली, उनकी डेथ हो गई थी. Following his death, she drew upon the memories of New Zealand discussed with her brother in writing some of her most well-known work, including Bliss and Other Stories, The Garden Party and Other Stories, and her novel The Alloy. The first one was published in 1920, Garden Party 1922, and her novel published in 1930. Mansfield suffered from tuberculosis during the last 5 years of her life. Mansfield's reputation as a writer of brilliantly compressed short fiction had been well established by the time of her death. Her final works, apart from unfinished materials published by Murray after her death, are The Dove's Nest 1923 and Something Childish again 1923. At the time of her death, on January 9th, 1923, she had several unfinished works, including poems, 1923, which, along with the Journal of Katherine Mansfield, published in 1927, and the Letters of Katherine Mansfield, 1928 1929, were published posthumously. Posthumously means after her death. Her husband, John Middleton Murray, published them. In his introduction to the 1930 American edition of the stories by Katherine Mansfield, Murray argued that the essential quality of her work was a kind of purity, not only one of style and vision, but of her whole life, her absolute fidelity. Fidelity means faithfulness to some spirit of truth which she served. Above all, Mansfield has consistently been praised for the compression and understatement of her writing, as well as for her capacity to pack the complex emotion and thought into the deceptively simple and direct outlines of her work. With this, we end her brief biography. We'll now look at the short story A Cup of Tea by Katherine Mansfield. I have given you the text of A Cup of Tea. Please go through it. I will give you the summary and other details in a short while. ये text चल रही है in dark print. आप इसको पढ़ लें. इसका मैं आपको PDF भी शेयर करूँगी. जैसा कि हमेशा करते हैं, उनको आप प्रिंट आउट निकाल सकते हैं, और अगर प्रिंट आउट नहीं निकालना है तो आप उसको अपने फ़ोन में या लैपटॉप के माध्यम से भी पढ़ सकते हैं. नाउ कमिंग टू द स्टोरी अ कप ऑफ टी, एंड वी लुक एट द इंट्रोडक्शन, समरी, एनालिसिस ऑफ द शॉर्ट स्टोरी. लेट अस नाउ लुक एट द शॉर्ट स्टोरी अ कप ऑफ टी by Katherine Mansfield. The introduction. You might be wondering how such a simple item as a cup of tea could give rise to an entire narrative. Katherine Mansfield, born 1888, died 1923, who was born in New Zealand but lived most of her working life as a writer in London, was an expert at writing this kind of short story. She would craft a narrative surrounding an item or event that at first seems so inconsequential. Inconsequential means not very important, but ultimately reveals serious and introspective themes beneath the surface of the story. Let us bite into a simple slice of life as we review A Cup of Tea. This 1922 story, A Cup of Tea, is written by Katherine Mansfield, which holds class consciousness and materialism as its pivot point. Pivot point means central point. Stunningly well characterized and magnificently portrayed against its plain title, this story remarkably presents a crystal clear image of class distinction and one's mad fondness towards materialism. It is just the same as The Doll's House and The Garden Party. The Doll's House, by the way, was prescribed for you in first year. As a matter of fact, that these stories also reflect upon the same issue of class distinction. Mansfield also tried to reflect upon the noble act of philanthropy. Philanthropy means giving charity. किसी के लिए दान वगैरह करना, and how people fancy this act to be the cause of ascension. Ascension means going to a higher level for their moral values among their social circle. Background. This story was written on 11th of January back in the early 1922, which was first published in the famous Storyteller magazine and later appeared in Mansfield's short story collection, The Dove's Nest. The story associates with the deplorable conditions, deplorable means hateful, and very bad conditions of New Zealand at the time when it used to be a British colony. द ट्रेंड्स ऑफ क्लास डिस्टिंक्शन यानी कि समाज में अलगाववाद, समाज में अलग अलग क्लास यानी कि श्रेणियों का विभाजन, वर एट इट्स पीक अ नोटिसेबल इश्यू which needed to be brought forward influenced Mansfield to pen it down. Pen it down means to write it down. The summary of the story. A Cup of Tea is set in 1920s London. Rosemary Fell, the protagonist, is a wealthy young matron. We meet her while she is on a shopping trip in town. In an antique shop, antique यानी कि पुराने ज़माने के डेकोरेशन के आइटम्स, कोई लैम्प शेड हो, कोई पेंटिंग हो, कोई स्टैंड हो, डेकोरेशन के लिए जो हम घर में सजावट का जो सामान मिलता है और वो भी पुराने ज़माने का, वो एंटीक्स कहलाते हैं. In an antique shop, she examines an expensive jewelry box that she would love to own. Yet, after inquiring about the price, she decides against the purchase, at least for that day. Without the longed for purchase, Rosemary returns to the street where she is approached by a poor, raggedly looking young woman. Raggedly मतलब जिसके फटेहाल कपड़े थे. About her own age. The young woman asks for the price of a cup of tea and says she has no money, which Rosemary finds unimaginable. Now, Rosemary एक धनवान परिवार से थी, तो जब एक गरीब महिला उनसे भीख मांगती है और उनसे कहती है कि एक चाय के कप के लिए पैसे दे दें, तो रोज़मेरी को विश्वास नहीं होता कि इतना भी कोई गरीब हो सकता है कि चाय तक नहीं खरीद सके. Suddenly inspired by the tales of Dostoevsky रशिया के बहुत फेमस शॉर्ट स्टोरी राइटर थे, that she has recently read, Rosemary experiences a charitable inspiration and takes the girl home. Of course, the reader questions, as Mansfield intended, the true sincerity of Rosemary's impulse. सवाल ये उठता है कि क्या रोज़मेरी सच में पूरे निष्ठा के साथ उस लड़की की मदद करना चाहती थी, इसलिए उन्हें उसे घर लेकर गई. कोई भी महिला, एक संपन्न सज्जन परिवार की महिला, किसी अनजान महिला को सड़क से उठाकर अपने घर ले जाएगी क्या? सवाल ये है. वी ऑल बिलीव इन हेल्पिंग द लेस फॉर्चुनेट. हाउएवर, दिस वेल्दी यंग वुमन सीम्स मोर टेकन विथ हर ओन फैंटेसी ऑफ फिलैंथ्रोपी. यानी कि दान करना केवल उनके ख्यालों में था, than any real desire to help. At any rate, the young Miss Smith does go home with Rosemary and is given an abundant tea with all the trimmings. उस गरीब लड़की का नाम मिस स्मिथ होता है. रोज़मेरी उसको अपने घर पे लेके जाती है और उसको चाय और चाय के साथ केक, बिस्किट्स वगैरह बहुत सारी चीज़ें खिलाती है. While they are having tea, Mr. Philip comes into the bedroom and finds this unexpected guest. अब सोचने की बात यह है कि रोज़मेरी मिस स्मिथ को अपने घर ही नहीं ले जाती, बल्कि उनको अपने निजी बेडरूम में उसको एंटरटेन करती हैं. रोज़मेरी फेल के हस्बैंड फिलिप वहाँ पहुँचते हैं अचानक से और वो देखते हैं कि उनके बेडरूम में तो एक अनजान महिला भी मौजूद है उनकी पत्नी के साथ. He takes Rosemary into another room where he first expresses disapproval of what his wife has done and then speaks appreciatively about their poor visitor's beauty. पहले तो फिलिप अपनी पत्नी को डांटते तो नहीं है, पर हाँ टोकते हैं कि एक अनजान महिला को कैसे ले आई तुम, और फिर कहते हैं कि वो कितनी खूबसूरत है. ये सुनकर रोज़मेरी भी चकित रह जाती है. Once back with her charitable case, Rosemary now feels awed and without direction. What should she do? Ultimately, she gives Miss Smith some cash and sends her on her way. अब हस्बैंड जब ये कहता है कि कितनी खूबसूरत लड़की है तो रोज़मेरी को समझ में नहीं आता कि अब क्या करे। उन्होंने तो एक समस्या मोल ले ली है। खैर वो अपने रूम में वापस जाकर उस लड़की को कुछ रुपए देती हैं, कुछ पैसे देती हैं और उसको अपने घर से रवाना कर देती हैं। एंक्शस अबाउट हर ओन अपीयरेंस, चिंता ये है रोज़मेरी को कि मेरा हस्बैंड क्या मुझे अभी भी पसंद करता है। उस लड़की के लिए तो उसने कह दिया कि वो इतनी खूबसूरत है। रोज़मेरी takes great care in dressing for dinner and seeks reassurance of her charms from Philip. Rising action can be observed when Rosemary decides to take the poor girl home with her. यानी कि कहानी की शुरुआत। The story reaches its climax when they reach home and the girl is served with tea, and then both the ladies are interrupted by the arrival of Phillips. The following action takes place when Rosemary walks to the library with Phillips. There is a twist in the plot at the time of Philip's confession about the beauty of Miss Smith, resulting in the change of Rosemary's attitude towards the girl. जब हस्बैंड एक अनजान लड़की के लिए कहता है कि वो खूबसूरत है तो रोज़मेरी एकदम से रुक जाती है और वो उसका जो उस लड़की को लेकर जो सोच होती है वो बदल जाता है। The story ends with a doubtful question raised by Rosemary regarding her own beauty. The theme: social class distinction and materialism. Materialism यानी कि भौतिकवाद, जब हम सांसारिक संसाधन को बहुत ज़्यादा इम्पोर्टेंस देते हैं। If you have seen television shows like Downton Abbey that depict, meaning that show, English society in the first part of the 20th century, you might have some idea about the importance of social class as it relates to how people act and treat one another. यानी कि समाज का विभाजन जो किसी के आर्थिक स्तर के आधार पर जब होता है, ये बहुत कॉमन और पुरानी प्रॉब्लम है। At that time, social class dictated actions, relations, and even business dealings, and there was really no escaping its influence. Charity towards the poor was encouraged, but certainly not by bringing a poor street girl into one's home. यानी कि दान देना तो ठीक है, लेकिन एक अनजान गरीब लड़की को घर ले जाना ये कोई भी नहीं करता। To the modern reader, the theme of social class restrictions may seem odd, but in Mansfield's culture, it was a very real concept. This story pictures the different behavior of the upper class people towards the lower class through the character of Rosemary. Her attitude and behavior gives quite a clear image of the mentality possessed by discriminating elites यानी कि कुलीन वर्ग के लोग, यानी कि अपर क्लास सोसाइटी के जो लोग होते हैं। एंड डिस्क्रिमिनेटिंग यानी कि भेदभाव करते, उनकी नज़र में भेदभाव ज़्यादा था, यानी कि वो अपने से कम अमीर लोगों को तुच्छ दृष्टि से देखते थे। Materialism is rigidly followed by the upper class. The more they have, the more they want. And they don't want anything ordinary. They want the best of all, the extraordinary, unaffordable by the commons. जितना मिलता है और ज़्यादा चाहिए, और सामान्य चीज़ें नहीं चाहिए, वो चाहिए जो स्पेशल हो, जो महंगी हो और जो कोई आम आदमी जिसको अफोर्ड नहीं कर सकता। Their want for more never dies. The velvet box in the story symbolizes materialism, while the cup of tea symbolizes the equal needs and requirements of the rich and the poor. Characters in the story. This story is comprised of these characters. First, Rosemary Fell, a socially poised. She's confident, she's rich. Poise का मतलब होता है जब आप बहुत कॉन्फिडेंस के साथ कोई भी काम करते हैं। A socially poised, rich married woman with a devoted and loving husband who has a great lifestyle. She is well dressed and well off with all the luxuries she desires for. Her interest is mainly for reading books, always indulged and above all, greatly inspired by the characters and their adventurous lives which she comes across in the stories. मतलब रिच है, धनवान है, हस्बैंड बहुत जेनरस है, उसके पास सब कुछ है, तो समय कैसे बिताएगी वो कुछ पढ़ती रहती है, बाज़ार में घूमती है, वो चीज़ें खरीदती है जो उसको जिसकी उसको ज़रूरत नहीं है तो भी खरीदती है, और फिर वो मिस स्मिथ जैसी महिलाओं को उठाकर अपने घर भी ले आती हैं. Her inspirational interest can be judged from the decision she takes when she interacts with a poor soul called Miss Smith by taking her home with a mere thought of it being an adventure for her. उनके लिए तो एक रोमांच की बात है. Recalling the stories of Dostoevsky. Apart from this possession and insecurity can be sensed in her character. यानी कि इसके अलावा आप ये भी देख सकते हैं कि वो बहुत सारी चीज़ें पाने की लालसा रखती है, लेकिन जब हस्बैंड एक अनजान लड़की की प्रशंसा करता है तो वो इनसिक्योर भी हो जाती हैं, परेशान हो जाती हैं ये सोचकर, और उस लड़की को तुरंत रवाना कर देती हैं अपने घर से. फिलिप्स फेल, husband of Rosemary, is in fact one of the richest persons of his society. He loves his wife devotedly and cares for her a lot. He calls Miss Smith pretty, much to his wife's chagrin. उसकी वाइफ को पसंद नहीं आती ये बात. Just to make her send Miss Smith away, as she refuses to do so when he asks her in the first place, even though making his wife feel insecure about herself and her beauty. संभवतः फिलिप्स फेल मिस स्मिथ की प्रशंसा जानबूझकर करता है. शायद वो अपनी वाइफ को समझते होंगे अच्छे से, शायद वो उनको यही उम्मीद होगी कि रोज़मेरी फेल उस लड़की को वहाँ से रवाना कर देगी, क्योंकि फिलिप्स फेल अपनी वाइफ को टोक चुके हैं कि वो कैसे एक अनजान लड़की को अपने घर ला सकती हैं. मिस स्मिथ, शी इज़ अ लीन एंड थिन पुअर गर्ल द एज ऑफ रोज़मेरी. लीन यानी कि पतली दुबली. शी कांट इवन अफोर्ड अ सिंगल कप ऑफ टी एंड कम्स टू आस्क रोज़मेरी टू पे हर द प्राइस ऑफ अ कप ऑफ टी. बहुत गरीब है, इतनी गरीब कि एक प्याला चाय का भी वो खरीद के नहीं पी सकती. शी इज़ एन ऑड पर्सन, फ्राइटेंड एंड कन्फ्यूज्ड. शी इज़ शॉक्ड व्हेन रोज़मेरी आस्क्स हर टू हैव अ कप ऑफ टी विथ हर एट हर होम. In Mr. Phillips' point of view, Miss Smith is very attractive and pretty. The shopkeeper, the owner of a very beautiful antique ornaments shop, which in fact was one of Rosemary's favorite shops. He would always be looking forward to have Rosemary at his shop and always saving a lovely piece of art for her, only just like he had been saving the eye-catching blue velvet box. Now the analysis of the short story, A Cup of Tea. Title of the story. The plain and ordinary title of the story has the tendency to gravitate readers towards it. Gravitate means move or push, as one can wonder what a title so simple can hold inside it. The charm of the story exceeds the imagination of the reader. Exceeds means goes beyond. Charm means attraction. As one comes across the contents of the story, finely sketched against the plain title of the story. यानी कि स्टोरीज के टाइटल से तो हमें समझ में ही नहीं आता, हम सोचते हैं इसमें क्या होगा, एक प्याले चाय कहानी का टाइटल है, लेकिन जब हम कहानी पढ़ते हैं तो समझ में आता है कितनी इंटरेस्टिंग है. द टाइटल ऑफ द स्टोरी इज़ रिलेटेबल टू द स्टोरी एंड at the point when a poor girl from the story asks a rich woman to pay her the price of a cup of tea. The setting of the story. The story setting takes place in the early 1900s back in Britain. Britain means England, UK, United Kingdoms. The story begins with a shopping scenario of Rosemary stopping at florist's shop and afterwards visiting the antique ornament shop till darkness strikes. It is where she meets poor Miss Smith outside the shop. तो ये brief analysis and summary थी short story A Cup of Tea by Katherine Mansfield की. ये story BA Part 3 English Literature के students के लिए prescribed है. Thank you.